welcome to this webinar. This is a first webinar on leveraging the Integrated National Financing Framework to finance the NDC. My name is Catherine Diamvala. I'm with the Climate Strategies and Policy team based in New York, and this team manages the Climate Promise. Before we get started, I just wanted to highlight that this webinar is available in, there is Spanish and French translation available. If you would like to follow the entire webinar in these languages, just click on the interpretation button at the bottom, and you can choose the channel that you would like to follow this webinar on. So I hope you found that button and now you are all connected to the channel that you would like. So welcome again. This webinar is a culmination of months of discussion between us and the colleagues in the Sustainable Finance Hub. And it was precisely, we have been supporting two different processes in the countries. One, the NDCs, and for those who are not familiar with the NDCs, these are commitments that countries make under the Paris Agreement to grow their economy in a way that's low carbon and resilient to climate change. So these, the NDCs actually reflect the sustainable growth trajectory that the countries have committed themselves under the Climate Promise. Under the Paris Agreements, rather. The INFF is a process also that UNDP and other UN agencies are supporting that allows countries to have a framework for financing their development priorities, which are usually in their national development plan. So we at UNDP are supporting these two processes, and oftentimes we find ourselves supporting financing strategies for NDCs separate from financing strategies for the national development priorities. So we are trying to bring these two processes together. There is no reason why a country should do them separately, but we know that there are challenges both at our level and also at the country level that are preventing us from doing these processes together. So we decided to have this call, this first webinar, as a first step to really understand what the INFF is all about, because it's a really well-structured methodology that we can all learn from, understand the different phases, and also from in each phase, try to identify together what are the entry points for integrating the NDC measures, both the mitigation measures and adaptation measures. So today we will be hearing from colleagues from different country offices and also from regional and HQ. We will first hear from Marcos Neto, who is the director of the Sustainable Finance Hub, and then from Cassie, who's the head of the Climate Promise and a strategic advisor on climate change. Neither of them were able to join us, and they regret not being here. Marcos is traveling, and Cassie is in another meeting, but they have recorded their messages that we will be playing in a moment. After those two welcome notes from both our directors, we will be hearing from Jennifer Bolmore, our colleague, who's the global coordinator of the Climate Promise. She will be talking about the Climate Promise. For those who are not very familiar, the phase 1 and phase 2 of the Climate Promise, where the initiative that's mostly responsible for supporting countries on their financing strategies for the NDC. After that, we will hear from our colleague Tim Straussen from the SDG financial specialist, who's also working for the hub, the Sustainable Finance Hub. Then we would dive into the INFF process itself. We will today we will only will have time to cover the two building blocks, the two different phases, the first two phases of the INFF process. We will hear from colleagues from Ecuador, Nicola Amhaz and Christian Lopez from UNDP Ecuador, who will share their experience on the inception phase of the INFF. And then we will hear from a colleague from Gabon, Serge Armand Moula, who will share the experience on the assessment and diagnostic phase. After those presentations, we will be splitting in small breakout groups. There will be 4 different groups, depending on the number. There will be a group, English-speaking group or 2 English-speaking group, a French-speaking group, and also a Spanish-speaking group. So these will be groups where we will really brainstorm on what we can do to get these processes integrated. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Tim, who is going to be playing the messages from Marcus Neto and Cassie Flynn. Thank you. Over to you, Tim.
Dear colleagues, first of all, accept my apology for not being here with you live, if you want, and thanks to my dear friend Cassie for leading this conversation, which is very, very important. And let me extend my welcome to you all as we bring together an exchange across our Sustainable Finance Hub and Climate Promise communities. This conversation we will have over the sessions today and tomorrow is a crucial one. In 2015, countries around the world agree to both the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement. And let's not forget, climate change is one of the SDGs. These set out a vision for sustainable development and the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions that will set us on a pathway globally towards a sustainable future. Financing is a critical driver of progress towards this vision. And the problem is not a lack of money. Global capital exceeds $430 trillion. There are sufficient resources to realize the aspirations of both the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. The cost of achieving the SDGs, even after the impact of the pandemic, is estimated at around $4.2 trillion each year, a little less than 1% of global capital. Yet our financial systems do not create incentives to invest where it is needed. The actions that we must take to realize the SDGs and achieve a just transitions are underfunded. Meanwhile, fossil fuel exploration and fossil fuel subsidies have increased since 2015. Changes needed in financing systems at both the global and at the country level. As countries seek to finance their national sustainable development plans, a growing number are using the Integrated National Financing Frameworks, or INFF approach. First introduced in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda in '86, 86 countries are now taking forward the development of an INFF. These INFFs bring together the public policy tools that governments use to mobilize, spend, and regulate public and private finance, and to align them with economic, social, and sustainable priorities. They are being used by governments to put in place holistic financing strategies for national sustainable development plans. 39 countries, for example, will develop a financing strategy for their national plans for the first time. Another 25 are using the INFF to extending existing financing strategies beyond public finance alone to consider the role of private finance. As countries develop their financing strategies, they are identifying and taking forward a large pipeline of reforms to public and private financing policies and instruments. More than 250 have already been prioritized for immediate action. A growing number of countries are connecting the dots between the INFFs and the NDCs as the preeminent policy document for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Our recent INFF survey found that 13 countries plan to address NDC financing priorities within their financing strategies, and further 16 are developing a financing strategy for a national plan that integrates the NDC's commitments. Many of the individual reforms being prioritized through INFFs will contribute towards green and climate objectives. At UNDP, we have a crucial role in this space. UNDP leads technical support to governments in the 86 countries developing an INFF. INFFs are one of the 5 service offers through the Sustainable Finance Hub and provide a foundation for the support we offer across public finance, private finance, and impact tracking for the SDGs. At the same time, you and the Climate Promise are responsible for UNDP being the world's largest offer on NDC support. So the exchange over these 2 days is an important foundation. The more we are able to connect our own work across these agendas, the more we will be able to help countries do the same. I hope that through these discussions, we can deepen our understandings of each other's work and identify tangible opportunities to bring them together at the country level, generating specific tools, guidance notes, and support to our country offices and their government's client. Looking ahead, what remains of the decade of actions in the COP27 and beyond, this is an important step in enabling us to help countries to shape financing strategies and financing solutions that put us on course towards a more sustainable and inclusive future. I wish you all the best for the exchange and leave you in the hands of Tim and Cassie and all the teams. Thank you very much.
A very warm welcome to the first webinar on leveraging integrated national financing frameworks to finance NDCs. Now, this webinar has been a long time coming, and thank you to everyone that made this possible. At UNDP, we talk a lot about integration, but really it starts with us. And it's conversations like these that can help people working on NDCs and help people working on INFFs to understand the opportunities together. It's certainly a case where 1 + 1 is way more than 2. And I encourage you to listen and share your expertise so we can deepen our collaboration and help countries to navigate this very rapidly changing world. As many of you know, UNDP's Climate Promise has supported 120 countries to enhance their pledges under the Paris Agreement. These pledges, or nationally determined contributions, translate how countries will adopt a low carbon and climate resilient pathway in key sectors like energy, agriculture, forestry, and industry. To date, 99 of the 120 countries have submitted their NDCs to the UNFCCC. Largely, these NDCs are more ambitious, more inclusive, and of higher quality. Now, the good news is that in comparison to the first generation of NDCs that were submitted in 2015, these NDCs offer more information on the cost of implementing the mitigation and adaptation measures that they contain. Now, the challenging news is that the aggregate number is staggering. According to a recent estimate by the UNFCCC, developing countries would need between 5.8 and 5.9 trillion, that's with a T, US dollars by 2030 to implement their NDCs. Of this amount, 112 billion is expected to come from domestic sources. Now, we get the question a lot that once an NDC is established, once it's agreed, what next? How can it lead to real impact on the ground? And to answer this question, we launched the second phase of the Climate Promise to support countries with their implementation effort. Now, financial resource mobilization is the key area of support that countries are requesting. Some countries are already turning their NDCs into investment plans to tap into public, private, domestic, and international support. Others are looking into carbon markets, and others are seeking to prepare bankable projects that could then be submitted to various climate finance windows. Now, collectively at UNDP, we have the tools to help in this effort, and we have to deploy these tools wherever they sit within UNDP to support our partner governments. Collaboration is key. And last year, together with the Sustainable Finance Hub, we launched the Green Bond Training. It was really successful, and we trained 150 people from 38 countries. And the online training package, which is still available on UNDP's Learning for Nature platform, is still being used by regional hubs to train more and more countries. And we have a lot to build on. And today we're building even further on this collaboration to come together and walk the talk on integration. And even more importantly, to help countries to take the bold steps that are needed to tackle the climate crisis and transition their economies towards sustainable development. Thank you so much for being here today. I wish you a very successful webinar and have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much to Cassie and Marcos. I know they wish they were here. Super excited about this webinar and the integration that we're trying to bring to our teams. And I couldn't agree more with them. Integration starts with us, with UNDP, before we start asking countries to integrate their work. So to set us off on better understanding the climate promise and the NDCs and the work that we have been doing over the past few years in supporting countries on their NDCs, we will be hearing from my colleague, Jennifer Baumwall, who's the Global Coordinator of the Climate Promise. Jenny, over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Kathy. And hello, colleagues. It's wonderful to be with you today and share with you a bit on the Climate Promise and provide a bit of a framing and a context for some of the discussions that will be ongoing today and tomorrow. So I will start off with just a very brief overview. As Kathy mentioned, some of these pieces have been mentioned by both Cassie and Marcos, as well as Kathy. But I'll dive in a bit more to understand a bit or share a bit where we are in the Climate Promise and also where countries are globally in terms of their NDC processes. So we have a better sense of where the opportunities are for entry points and pulling these various work streams together. So just to give a bit of background for those who are not as familiar, UNDP's Climate Promise was launched in 2019, and it was launched on the sidelines of the Secretary General's Climate Action Summit, and it was a call to all countries, all parties, all UN agencies to do whatever we could to support countries in their effort to enhance their NDCs. And as Kathy mentioned earlier, the NDCs, or the national pledges, are really countries' commitments under the Paris Agreement to contribute and help meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, both the mitigation goals, the temperature, 1.5 degree temperature goal, as well as goals related to adaptation and finance. And so every 5 years under the Paris Agreement, countries are expected to update their targets with an effort to make them more and more ambitious, so that over time, we're moving collectively and globally towards the goals of the Paris Agreement. And so in 2019, this was our UNDP's offer to countries to say, we are here to help you do this revision and help you be as ambitious as possible. We had done quite a lot of work leading up to that point. We have, as many of you know, a pretty extensive portfolio in supporting countries in their first NDC, both in defining and then implementing the NDC under the NDC support program. And this was, through this work, we had really identified a number of key areas where countries saw bottlenecks for being ambitious. And you can see across the bottom, these 5 service lines are really where we landed in terms of what countries need in order to help raise their ambition and put forward a more robust second version of their NDC. And so we have building political will and societal ownership, reviewing and aligning existing targets with policies and measures, incorporating new sectors in greenhouse gases, assessing costs and investment opportunities, and then monitoring progress to ensure that countries are on their way to meeting those targets. And so that service line 4, you see here on assessing costs and investment opportunities, was one of the most demanded service lines of the Climate Promise. Many countries wanted to focus on how do we turn these targets and cost these targets and put in place strategies that help us identify where the financing will come from. And so that's really where a lot of these pieces come together and what we'll be discussing today. But as both Cassie and Kathy mentioned, under the first phase of the Climate Promise, we were supporting 120 countries. We also had a broad network of partners, working with over 35 partners, and within the context of the NDC partnership. We have seen quite a lot of progress and results to date in terms of our support to countries. As of July, 101 Climate Promise countries have submitted their NDC. And this was just a couple countries over the weekend to bring us over the 100 threshold, representing over 20% of global emissions. And over 80% of, or 84% of developing countries' emissions. So we saw that many of these countries were putting forward more ambitious targets, 90% increased mitigation ambition, all of which included energy in their NDC, 96% increased adaptation ambition, many of which linked to national adaptation plan processes. 96% included gender, 97% included youth considerations, really showing a broader engagement and inclusivity aspect of the NDC process. And NDCs were in general of higher quality with better data, the detailed costing that helps to really ensure implementation of these NDCs, and linked to various development and sectoral planning. In many cases, this was also explicitly linked to the SDG processes in country, which I think is also very relevant when it comes to linking with INFFs. We also saw countries that were linking very closely with green recovery processes, as well as ensuring a broader engagement, as I said, as stakeholder involvement and mobilization of society through our flagship initiatives under Mission 1.5, as well as the People's Climate Vote. In terms of what countries have delivered under the Climate Promise, this gives just a snapshot of some of the results and the outputs. And you can see, I won't go through all of them, but you can see 90 countries are establishing or strengthening existing policies, institutions, and capacities, really focusing on the implementation aspect of NDCs. 60 countries have developed financing strategies, roadmaps, or assessments for budget and finance frameworks. So these elements, which were embedded as part of the revision and enhancement process, really are setting the foundation for how to implement and realize these targets as countries move forward. And again, with the work that's being supported around financing strategies and roadmaps, this is really a perfect opportunity to bring together some of the tools and approaches, conversations that are happening in country around both the NDC and the INFF. Now, one thing that we have done we've invested a lot in under the Climate Promise is collecting data and tracking what's happening in countries. And I just wanted to flash on the screen some of the various dashboards that we've been developing that really to collect what's happening in countries, what ambition is looking like, how NDCs are really moving forward, and what some of the trends are. You can see we have an ambition tracker that we're doing jointly with UNFCCC to really show where countries are on this question of ambition and aligning with the goals of the Paris Agreement. We're now looking at some of the longer term strategy development, tracking LTS or long-term strategies and net zero goals, which are also encouraged under the Paris Agreement to look at net zero by 2050. We came up with a lot of this data is compiled in our quarterly or reports under the Climate Promise, which show some of the trends. But we also have every 2 years an NDC Outlook report. Most recently at COP26, we launched the State of Ambition report, which really dives into some of these elements, looking at both what countries are doing on ambition, but also the steps that they're taking to try to turn this ambition into action. And there are a few lessons or key points that I think are coming out of this, and I'll highlight 2 of them here, which I think are most relevant for these conversations. First, when we talk about NDCs, while it's part and included within the context of the Paris Agreement, NDCs are becoming more than just a document that's submitted to the Paris Agreement. We really see a trend in countries that NDCs are owned, are endorsed and really recognized by the highest levels of government, whether it's head of state, ministerial level across different sectoral ministries, where NDCs are really put forward as a country's priorities when it comes to various development drivers. And Kathy mentioned this at the beginning of the session as well, that NDCs are really meant to lay out this pathway for low carbon and resilient development for countries. And we really see that trend as we support so many countries around the world. The other trend we see, and this is related, is that many of the NDCs are covering a broad range of sectoral issues. And you can see here some of the statistics. 100% of NDCs include energy targets, 88% look at adaptation, and that touches on water security, food security, early warning systems and disaster risk reduction, and so on. 90% cover land use and land use coverage and forestry sector, with 57% looking at forestry and 21% on wetlands. 90% cover agriculture. So you really see that NDCs are starting to define and really reflect a lot of these various sectoral targets or priorities that countries have in country. And most importantly for this conversation, almost all of countries reference finance for implementation in their NDCs. It's a bit mixed in terms of how detailed countries go into this question. Some countries do a very comprehensive costing of what it would take to meet targets. Other countries mention it in more broad terms. But this is something that we're also working with countries to help define and ensure that this is part of the effort of defining targets to really understand what it would cost to get there. And so and this will be my last slide before passing it on, but just to give you a sense of where we're headed on the climate promise under this second phase. We have already started rolling out support to countries focused more on the implementation side of NDCs. We have about 60 countries now that have received additional funding this year to start this process. And we're really focused on three key pillars. One, looking at scale and speed. So how do countries strengthen their governance and financing mechanisms to be able to implement NDCs? And this is really where a lot of these enabling environments, a lot of the financing questions come into place. Developing these financing strategies, identifying potential financial flows, and so on. This is really part of that pillar. The second, we're looking at amplifying ambition. So how do countries establish more of these longer term development pathways that are net zero, are aligned with net zero, and looking at climate resilient approaches, and of course aligned with the SDGs. And this is really important in terms of supporting NDCs over time as they start to ratchet up and align with these longer term goals that we know, according to science and according to the Paris Agreement, we need to meet. And then finally, a real focus on inclusivity, ensuring that the actors within society are systematically engaged and empowered to contribute to the NDC implementation, as well as contribute to these longer term development pathways. So there are definitely entry points in all three of these pillars where we can look to align and integrate our work between NDCs and INFFs. And so I think there's a lot to discuss here, and look forward to the conversations both today and tomorrow in terms of how we can really leverage the footprint that we have under the climate promise and the work that we're already doing to support NDC implementation, to pull together the pieces and really help countries to address this key question on how do we finance climate action and how do we realize our NDC targets. So with that, I will pass it back to Kathy. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jenny. Yes, of course, a lot of opportunities. Of course, when we started looking at this, we were comparing countries where we have a climate promise and countries where we have INFF, and there is so much overlap. And the fact that we have 60 countries under the climate promise doing financing strategies already telling, I'm sure half of those countries at the minimum are doing INFF as well. So thanks for bringing us all up to speed on NDCs and the climate promise. Now we are going to switch gear from the NDCs to the INFF. We will have our colleague Tim introduce us to the topic, and then we will go into the building blocks. So Tim, please, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Kathy, and thanks, Jenny, for a good introduction to the NDCs and to the climate promise. I'm going to attempt to do the same, as Kathy said, before we dive into more detail and we hear from the practical experience from colleagues at the country level, to just give a bit of an overview about integrated national financing frameworks, what we're seeing across the countries that are developing them, and the role of UNDP. I'll start, and not to overload with pre-recorded material, but I'll start by just playing a short video. INFFs are about, well, they're an approach for government to connect the planning and the financing policy functions in coordination with other partners at the country level. But I'll start with a short video just from some of the government policymakers that we're working with that I think will help to set the scene on INFFs, and then give a short overview myself and some reflections before we move into the to hearing from our colleagues in country offices. So
given the increased SDGs financing gap, particularly due to the COVID-19 pandemic, it is imperative for us to establish the most optimal sustainable financing pathway to meet the SDGs achievement and Paris Climate Accord.
I will define an INFF as an arrangement that presents us a range of opportunities and options to mobilize the resources we need.
It's a framework which brings together government, private sector, civil society, and development partners
in raising awareness of SDG-aligned development financing priorities and sparking important discussions.
Todos los recursos, tanto del sector público como del sector privado, nos deben alcanzar esos objetivos que nos hemos puesto como país, esa Agenda 2030.
Great. Well, we heard there from a number of policymakers just a glimpse of how they're seeing and using the INFF approach, and I'll just present quickly before we hear from the experience at the country level something of the overview that we're seeing across integrated national financing frameworks. So perhaps just to start from the space that integrated national financing frameworks sit within, and I think Kathy was saying at the outset that for many countries, an integrated national financing framework is designed to support a national development plan. Countries have a national development plan which articulates their sustainable development aspirations, and to a greater or lesser extent often mainstreams the SDGs and connects with other strategies and plans and commitments, including NDCs, at the national level. And I think we all know that achieving those national sustainable development objectives will require quite a large range and diverse range of investments of public and private capital and spending that is needed to achieve those aspirations. From the perspective of government, they have a range of policies and instruments, regulations, processes, partnerships that they use to govern and to mobilize and invest and to influence the way that other investments, private investments, are made in each of those areas of public and private financing. What we've seen in the past is that there's often been a disconnection, a gap between these two, between the aspirations for sustainable development at the top and between the investments that are needed to make it a reality and the policy tools at government's disposal for influencing and for governing those investments. And so this is the space in which the integrated national financing framework approach sits. It's an approach that brings together the full range of policy tools that government has across the public and private financing landscape and aims to add value in three key ways. So it aims vertically in the diagram here to increase the integration between the policies that government uses in each of those areas of public and private financing, for mobilizing and spending revenue, for regulating the business and financial sector, for incentivizing certain types of private investment, with the objectives of a national sustainable development plan at the top. And beyond just the economic objectives that perhaps have been connected in the past, to think about the social and sustainable development objectives as well. A second integration is across those policy areas, and I think we all know that there are sometimes long-standing issues with ministerial briefs and ministerial focus and departmental focus, focusing in on particular policy areas and not talking to each other very well across these different areas of financing policies. But the integrated national financing framework provides a platform for bringing those policy areas together and identifying and addressing the trade-offs and the synergies between them, and for building a more coherent approach to financing across the policy tools at government's disposal. And then it provides a platform for deeper integration and collaboration across public and private actors, for the actors that actually invest the resources, that make the investments that are going to be needed in order to realise national sustainable development objectives. And as I said, the aim of the INFF is really to bring together an approach that cuts across the financing landscape as a whole, that brings together the policies for governing public finance, the way that government mobilises and spends its own revenues, its budget, but also the way that its state entities and public entities operate, the way that private capital might be mobilised behind public investments, and the way that markets, the financial sector, the business sector are regulated in relation to the SDGs. So the idea of the INFF is that it can add value and fit this gap, which we see in many countries, in terms of strengthening the integration across these dimensions between financing policies and national sustainable development aspirations. There are 4 building blocks to an INFF, and this is a diagram which, if you're not already familiar with, then perhaps you will be by the end of the session, as we've structured the discussion today and tomorrow around each of these building blocks with our country office colleagues sharing their experiences and reflections in each of them. I think the INFF is really centered around, the financing strategy in the bottom right, that financing strategy which provides a place for government to articulate how it will connect its policies with sustainable development aspirations in a way that's rooted in the national institutions for planning and for financing policy, the national ministries, other actors and processes at the national level for governing planning and financing, in a way that's informed through assessments and diagnostics of financing needs, of the scale and type of investments that are needed, of the trends and opportunities to mobilise and align capital, as well as the risks and some of the policy and capacity and other binding constraints that are present at the country level. And as well, the fourth monitoring and review building block, the way that financing investments and spending are tracked to understand what is being spent and invested, but crucially also its impact, its contributions towards the SDGs, towards sustainable development, green development. So there are these 4 building blocks of the INFF, which are a structured way that help governments to think about and adopt this approach for bringing together their policy tools within national systems to strengthen that connection between planning and financing policy for the SDGs. So that's the concept of an INFF, and we'll explore that much further. To turn to the practice, we're seeing 86 countries using the INFF approach. These 86 countries are at different stages in the process, but we're expecting around about 40 of those to develop their financing strategy in the next 12 months. So we're seeing that many countries are approaching a very crucial stage as that key part of the INFF approach is articulated and finalised in the coming months. Some of the most advanced are Mongolia, Nigeria. We'll hear from some of these colleagues in the country offices tomorrow, are close to approving their financing strategy. And then there's many more countries which are currently developing it and will have that in place in the coming 6 to 12 months. So in terms of what we're seeing through these INFF processes, which are country-led processes, UNDP's role is leading technical support to governments, but these are country-led, government-led processes. What we're seeing is that INFFs are being used as a platform for bringing together quite a broad constituency of actors, a much broader constituency than perhaps has been brought together in the past to consider SDG financing issues at the national level. We're seeing that most countries are guiding the process through some kind of cross-governmental oversight committee. The diagram here shows the typical or presents some data on the membership of those oversight committees across countries. They're very often led by the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Planning, bringing together those core functions. Around about 15% include the Ministry of Environment as an actor. So there are some countries that are already making strong connections with green and climate objectives, but many are based to build on perhaps for others. We're seeing that in some countries there are civil society and private sector representatives within the oversight committee, but in many others, and in fact in most countries, the INFF process is structured around a series of financing dialogues that bring together these actors as well as many others from across the public and private financing the public and private sectors in order to shape a discussion around the priorities, the challenges, the opportunities for financing sustainable development at the national level, and chart a way forwards towards that financing strategy, a prioritized set of reforms that can strengthen those connections between planning and financing for the SDGs. So we're seeing that the INFF is a platform for bringing together a wide constituency of actors at the national level. And we are seeing, as I said, that countries are developing new financing strategies, strengthening financing strategies in a way that's quite different from the past. So 39 countries will develop a financing strategy for the first time. So they've had a national development plan or national development plans in the past, but they have not had a strategy for how they would be financed. And 39 countries will introduce that for the first time. Another 25 countries are strengthening an existing financing strategy. And most commonly, they've had a financing strategy associated with the National Development Plan in the past that only really considers public finance, or perhaps public finance plus ODA. And the INFF approach is being used to help them bring in that wider range of policy tools for mobilizing and incentivizing private capital, in particular, in line with national sustainable development objectives. These financing strategies typically are associated with or embedded in a medium-term plan, often a 5-year plan that cuts across the SDGs, the economic, social and sustainable dimensions of national sustainable development as a whole. But also we are seeing increasingly within that countries are making connections with more specific policy agendas, and particularly around NDCs. 13 countries, as Marcus was saying in his introduction, 13 countries are mainstreaming NDCs within their financing strategy. Another 16 are using the financing strategy to support a national plan that prioritizes and mainstreams NDCs within it. So we're seeing INFFs helping countries to, or being used by countries to put in place a new strategic approach for financing national sustainable development. And as that process advances, and as I said, for many countries, we're still in the fairly early stages of shaping those financing strategies. But as that process advances, we're already seeing countries identify and take forwards quite a wide range and quite a diverse range of financing innovations in financing policies, instruments, regulations, other aspects of the governance of public and private financing. This is quite a complicated slide. I won't go through it in detail. And I'm sure actually we'll hear from many of the colleagues who speak over the rest of the session today and tomorrow about some of these specific reforms that are being taken forwards. But the message I wanted to get across is that we're seeing the INFF process being used to identify and catalyze changes in these financing policies that are aligning them more closely to national sustainable development objectives that are unlocking and will unlock new capital for investment in the SDGs. So perhaps I don't want to take up too much time. I want to allow a lot of time to hear from the country level and for discussion as well. But perhaps just before I close and pass on, just to bring it back to the 4 building blocks of the INFF. I think from where we see from the support that we're providing to country offices as they work with governments on the INFF, I think we've got a number of ideas about some of the entry points for INFFs and NDCs and where they can come together, about how the INFF process can provide a platform for bringing in the discussion on NDC financing to the Ministry of Finance and others that are at the heart of shaping the financing strategy, about bringing the NDCs into the assessments and diagnostics and into the financing solutions, many of which already have green and sustainable dimensions to them as the financing strategy is shaped, and about some of the innovations that countries are making in terms of how they monitor finance and its impacts, both on the SDGs and in terms of its environmental impacts. I won't say too much on this now, but I wanted to just leave us with the building blocks, as this is how we're structuring the conversation moving forwards, and very much look forward to hearing from our colleagues at the country level, but also in the discussions today and tomorrow about some of the entry points that you're seeing, about the connections that can be made, and about the value and the opportunity for taking those forward. So I'll stop there and pass back to Kathy, and very much look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tim, for giving us that overview of the INFF as a whole. Today we will be able to cover one of the building blocks, and The inception phase, which is not part of the building block, but a really important phase. This is, I think, where most of the decisions are being made before the process starts. And to introduce us to the inception phase, we will hear from our colleague Nergis Gulasan, who's a SDG finance advisor based in Panama, right, Nergis? And who will introduce the inception phase, and then we will pass it to colleagues from the Ecuador country office who will speak about their experience. I don't know if Christian and Nicolas will speak in Spanish. If they do, those who are following the webinar in English, you can go to the interpretation button again, click on the English channel, and then you will get the translation in English there. So if you have any question, just put your question in the chat. Nergis, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katie. Greetings from Panama colleagues. Very quickly, I will share a few slides. Let me, okay, here. I hope you can see my slide.
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect. So as Tim mentioned, we have 4 building blocks, the core elements of designing an INFF. And for each of these building blocks, we have detailed methodology that was led by UNDESA with inputs from us, the IFIs, and many other UN agencies and organizations. So that's what you see in the middle. But given the disconnect of linking planning and financing processes that we had seen in the initial years of SDG implementation and the implementation of the Addis Agenda, it's also critical that the countries start these government-led processes with some systems in place. So that's why the UN also provided detailed guidance on the inception phase, and there are some recommendations and suggested steps that I will talk about. So the inception phase is basically about how to start this process and who should be involved. And Tim emphasized the need for integration across sectors and different actors in the public and private sectors. So in these government-led processes, it's really critical to establish the foundation for national ownership and build consensus on a way forward. And to do that, it's essential to bring all key stakeholders together and galvanize commitments to the process. And so the first step is about a scoping exercise. So this is basically to gather all available information, different diagnostics, assessments that already exist in the country related to each 4 building blocks of this process, and basically have a sense of available financing and capacity, and also to identify potential gaps and constraints associated with financing national sustainable development priorities. And the second suggested step is about institutionalizing the INFF. It's critical to have an institutional home within the government to lead this process. So Tim mentioned the oversight committees, the oversight bodies that are being established in these 86 countries. So that is a recommendation of the global guidance to establish such a committee to drive the design of the INFF and to lead the implementation of an INFF. There's the recommendation of identifying mechanisms for advancing reforms and platforms to engage actors that are non-state. And the third suggested step is basically concluding this inception phase with an agreement on next steps, which is ideally a plan, a roadmap for different steps of designing an INFF. So the idea here is to have a plan agreed upon by the oversight committee, again, led by the government. And depending on the country, it may take different forms. We see that in 86 countries that we are supporting globally. And so Tim mentioned the different actors that we have in the oversight committees. As he indicated, in more than 60%, it's the Ministry of Finance, and the other key ministries are also involved. And just one point I wanted to highlight is that in many countries, it's also critical to have the president's or the prime minister's office also to ensure coordination across ministries. And countries are not starting from scratch. So, for example, 60% of the oversight committees that are being formalized or that already exist now, they are embedded within an existing mechanism. And in about 40% new mechanisms are created. We see growing partnerships to support the governments for these INFFs. So in addition to the more than 20 UN agencies, we have the World Bank and the IMF involved in many countries, as well as other IFIs, multilateral development banks, and bilateral donors. And the G20 also endorsed a framework for voluntary support to the INFFs. And thanks to this work also, UNDP established an INFF facility to be able to support the governments who continue this work after the inception phase, after the assessment and diagnostics, to keep the momentum going. With that, let me stop, Katie. Thank you.
I'm having trouble unmuting. Thank you so much, Nergis. I think we'll jump right over to Nicholas.
Thank you very much, Catherine. As you mentioned, I'll be switching to Spanish for my presentation, and I'll be doing it with my colleague, Cristian Lopez, from the NDC project in Ecuador. Muy buenas tardes. Y muy buenos días también, colegas. Es un gusto estar aquí. La oficina del PNUD en Ecuador agradece increíblemente la oportunidad que nos brindan para comentarles de nuestras experiencias en la implementación de los marcos nacionales de financiamiento integrado y de las contribuciones nacionalmente determinadas en el caso específico de Ecuador. En lo que se refiere a los marcos nacionales de financiamiento integrado, el proyecto que está a cargo de asistir esta iniciativa que es liderada por el gobierno y que tiene el compromiso de implementación del gobierno, se denomina Atacando la Desnutrición Crónica Infantil y Financiando los ODS en Ecuador. El primer componente está a cargo del PNUD y tiene el propósito justamente de implementar el Marco Nacional de Financiamiento Integrado en Ecuador. Por otra parte, el segundo componente, a cargo del UNICEF y el Programa Mundial de Alimentos, espera pilotear este marco a la política específica del combate a la desnutrición crónica infantil en el Ecuador. Este proyecto fue diseñado entre finales del 2019 e inicios del año 2020 y postuló al financiamiento del Fondo Conjunto para los ODS para poder ser ejecutado. Una vez que recibió este financiamiento, el proyecto inició alrededor de finales del año 2020 y se ha estado ejecutando con una fecha límite programada para diciembre de este año 2022. En términos de la fase de incepción, que es el tema sobre el cual quiero brevemente hablarles del día de hoy, el proyecto fue diseñado de manera conjunta tanto con el Ministerio de Economía y Finanzas de Ecuador como con la Secretaría Nacional de Planificación, identificándolos como socios estratégicos y contrapartes nacionales principales para este proceso. Y se acordó como una hoja de ruta los contenidos principales dentro del proyecto para un ejercicio de implementación y de trabajo dentro de los 4 building blocks o bloques de construcción establecidos en la metodología de los marcos. Sin embargo, es muy importante destacar que nosotros enfrentamos durante la ejecución del proyecto un cambio de administración gubernamental en mayo del 2021. Hubieron elecciones y evidentemente un nuevo equipo de administración gubernamental entró en funciones. En este caso, ¿qué es lo que le pasa a nuestro proyecto? Tuvo que extender su fase de incepción o reiniciar su fase de incepción de manera simultánea al ejercicio que ya estaba en curso dentro de los 4 bloques de construcción. En ese sentido, quisiera resaltar 2 temas muy importantes para la fase de incepción. Número 1, el ejercicio de trabajar con todos los niveles de las instituciones contrapartes, es decir, acercarse a los ministros, a los viceministros, a los subsecretarios, a los directores, especialistas y analistas con sus respectivas contrapartes, para realizar un ejercicio de nueva socialización. Y la segunda mención que voy a hacer, y muy importante también, es esta flexibilidad. Durante el diseño del proyecto nosotros tuvimos evidentemente la fase de incepción de los marcos nacionales de financiamiento integrado, pero al tener una nueva administración, esta fase de incepción no necesariamente va a coincidir con las prioridades que tiene la nueva administración, el nuevo gobierno. Y en ese sentido es muy importante ser flexible. Y hemos hecho un ejercicio muy fuerte de adaptabilidad y de equilibrio para poder coordinar el proyecto que ya estaba definido con las nuevas prioridades del nuevo gobierno. Entonces, resalto nuevamente estos 2 temas, una estrategia de socialización constante en todos los niveles ministeriales y también la gran importancia de la flexibilidad para encontrar el equilibrio entre las prioridades que puedan presentarse con la nueva administración y los objetivos de los marcos nacionales de financiamiento integrado y de los proyectos que los están implementando o que están asistiendo a su implementación. En esta presentación no voy a entrar tanto en el contenido de mis láminas porque podrá ser compartida, pero más quisiera comentarles un poco del ejercicio interno que se ha hecho en el PNUD, en la oficina del PNUD en Ecuador, para integrar completamente a los marcos nacionales de financiamiento integrado en la estructura de trabajo de toda la oficina. Como podrán ver ustedes en pantalla, aquí tenemos los bloques de diagnóstico, de financiamiento de estrategia, de monitoreo y de gobernanza. Y dentro de cada una de estas láminas podemos ver las metodologías o las acciones que el proyecto Financiando los ODS y Atacando la Desnutrición Crónica Infantil se encuentra implementando, pero también podemos ver las actividades o las temáticas que aborda el proyecto del NDCs en Ecuador y que coinciden con cada uno de los bloques de construcción. En estas láminas estamos presentándoles específicamente el SDG Financing y el NDC-SP. Sin embargo, es importante señalarles que este ejercicio lo hemos aplicado a todas las actividades, a todas las iniciativas de toda la oficina del PNUD en Ecuador para fortalecer nuestro discurso. Este fortalecimiento nos ha permitido entrar con una articulación mucho más sólida y no solo con nuestras contrapartes nacionales, sino también con nuestros otros socios en el desarrollo, otros organismos multilaterales, instituciones financieras internacionales y todos los actores relevantes con los cuales nosotros hemos estado trabajando para implementar los marcos nacionales de financiamiento integrado, las NDC y todos los proyectos de la oficina. Entonces, resalto este trabajo que ha sido muy importante de articular todas las intervenciones de la Oficina de Ecuador del PNUD dentro del esquema de los marcos nacionales de financiamiento integrado. Y esto ha fortalecido el éxito o los logros de la fase de incepción de los MNFIs. No me extiendo más, tenemos muy poco tiempo y cedo la palabra a mi colega Cristian López, del coordinador del proyecto NDC en Ecuador, quien les va a hablar específicamente de la temática de los NDCs.
Gracias, Nicolás. Pues buenos días y buenas tardes, buenas noches con todos y todas los que nos acompañan. Brevemente, quería hacer la relación de lo que ha manifestado Nicolás con el trabajo que se viene haciendo desde las NDCs aquí en Ecuador, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, una vez que hemos repasado estas 4 etapas de los marcos de financiamiento, de diagnóstico, estrategia, reporte y gobernanza, comentarles que en cada uno de ellos, y ustedes lo pudieron revisar brevemente en las láminas, a través de las metodologías de trazabilidad de finanzas climáticas que hemos estado implementando ya desde el año 2020 aquí en Ecuador, nos ha permitido tener información relevante con algunos resultados también significativos, pero ir en línea, ¿no?, con lo que mencionaba Nicolás de esta estrategia de los marcos de financiamiento. Tal vez darles algunos insights, ¿no es cierto?, importantes de las NDCs y esta alianza o esta alineación con los marcos estratégicos de financiamiento y comentarles que todos los resultados públicos y privados de gasto climático han considerado las iniciativas de la NDC, pero además han sido clasificados por los mismos sectores. Esto es muy importante porque nos permite obtener información sectorizada en los componentes de mitigación y adaptación al cambio climático y alinearlos con el gasto que se está dando en el presupuesto público y a su vez también desde el sector privado, ¿no? Para esto hemos utilizado metodologías que ustedes bien conocen como el CPIR y el PCIR. De ahí, decirles también que los resultados han demostrado, y esta es información muy importante, el gap de financiamiento que existe para adaptación y mitigación al cambio climático. Es importante también, y pronto estaremos compartiendo con todos y todas los resultados finales de estas metodologías. Es importante ver cómo en un país en donde normalmente deberíamos estar bastante enfocados en la adaptación al cambio climático, se ve una importante inversión en mitigación, ¿no? Entonces, todos estos resultados ayudan para continuar mejorando la formulación de política pública en el país. Además, mencionarles también, y creo que es algo muy importante dentro de las oportunidades de alinear las NDCs o conectar, ¿no es cierto?, las NDCs con los temas de financiamiento, y es que actualmente este tipo de metodologías, sobre todo las de monitoreo, reporte y monitoreo, como por ejemplo son en el caso de Ecuador con la implementación del Climate Budget Tagging, ¿no es cierto?, tagueo climático, han sido fundamentales para inclusive obtener financiamiento internacional. Está atado a financiamiento multilateral directo y de libre disponibilidad para el gobierno. Esto nos ha dado un avance bastante significativo en la relación con el Ministerio de Economía y Finanzas, puesto que requieren de esta información para poder acceder, o es uno de los requerimientos para poder acceder a estos financiamientos multilaterales. Y por último, comentarles que en Ecuador se empieza a trabajar en la regulación en una ley de cambio climático y por supuesto la información que hemos obtenido a través de las metodologías de finanzas climáticas es fundamental para inclusive proponer o sugerir, ¿no es cierto?, un porcentaje por ley de inversión en los temas de cambio climático. Entonces, esto no hubiese sido posible si no hubiésemos hecho esta alineación o esta conexión con las NDCs también. De ahí, mencionarles algunos retos que tenemos, ¿no es cierto? Por supuesto, el reto fundamental y que está alineado a las NDCs es cumplir ese gap que tenemos para poder implementar las iniciativas, sobre todo del escenario condicional. Incrementar ese valor o apalancar esos financiamientos son fundamentales para lograr los objetivos que el país se ha propuesto de cambio climático, pero además también consideramos idóneo, no sé, alinear los actuales flujos de financiamiento que el país ya está accediendo desde la perspectiva de cambio climático, ¿no? Y esto está pasando, como les había mencionado ya en en la diapositiva anterior, pues como sabemos, alcanzar o apalancar ese financiamiento que es necesario para cubrir la brecha de las NDCs es bastante importante, pero alineando flujos de financiamiento que en este momento están ocurriendo, pues podría ser una oportunidad o un reto a futuro. Algo que también es interesante es, y lo vemos como un reto, es poder en los siguientes años alinear esta política de Green Recovery, ¿no es cierto?, que hemos estado trabajando igual en el Ecuador, y poder hacer la conexión con los marcos de financiamiento, pero a su vez también con las NDCs, ¿no? Entonces ahí vemos un reto importante que seguramente lo vamos a tener que ir abordando en los siguientes meses y años. Y por último, comentar que el institucionalizar el reporte desde una perspectiva de bottom-up desde abajo hacia arriba es es el siguiente paso del reporte y el monitoreo de las finanzas climáticas, ¿no? Actualmente hemos tenido un reporte, o estamos trabajando en un reporte que está muy centralizado en el Ministerio de Economía y Finanzas, pero cada vez ir bajando eso a las diferentes instituciones que también tienen relación con cambio climático, pues es uno de los retos a futuro, y poder institucionalizarlo así como venimos trabajando la institucionalización en el Ministerio de Economía y Finanzas. Muchas gracias a todos. Con eso terminamos por Ecuador.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Christian and Nicolas. Thank you. I think Ecuador is one of those countries that we can learn from. As you move towards the other building blocks, from my understanding, you are just redoing the inception phase, unfortunately, but I think it's nice to have that flexibility to revisit the inception phase when you have a new administration. So thank you for sharing this experience. We look forward to following what you are doing in the next building blocks. We are a bit behind on time, so I'm going to move straight to Ankun, who's going to introduce the building block on assessment and diagnostic, and he will be followed by Serge from the Gabon country office on that building block. Ankun, over to you.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
So can I be heard?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, thanks very much, Kathy. So I will give first a very brief introduction on the building block 1, assessment and diagnostics. And the building block 1 is very important because it can give us a baseline picture regarding the financing needs, financing landscape, the relevant risks, and the building and the binding constraints behind. It can then share some light even on the potential gaps in monitoring and governance mechanisms. With such information, it can be part of the starting point for us to develop an integrated financing strategy. So there are some suggested key questions and key steps that will help us guide the building block 1 exercise. On financing needs assessment, we can ask how much is needed and what types of finance are the best suited ones to meet the estimated costs. And to answer that question, we need to estimate the financing costs of implementing the sustainable development priorities, maybe at different levels. The analysis can then help us inform the resource mobilization targets and match different types of financing with planned investments. On financing landscape assessments, we can ask what types of financing exist and what are the sources and how much is really available. And for that, this will involve assessing different types of financing flows, both in terms of their quantity and their quality. It can then share some insights on the opportunities and challenges in mobilizing and aligning investment towards the identified development priorities. On risk assessment, the key question can be what risks exist already for the country's ability to finance sustainability, and how can those risks be really addressed? So this may need analysis on the risks and their impacts on the country's financing systems, and for us to further identify the potential policy options to either reduce, to transfer, or even to avoid those risks. So through this, it can help us strengthen the government's understanding of those risks and their ability to incorporate the risks into their national development planning process. And finally, on binding constraints assessments, the key question will be, what are the biggest challenges or impediments to the effective mobilization and alignment of financing with development priorities? We need to identify the key problem areas regarding the financing flows and the financing policies, and also, very importantly, the underlying binding constraints or reasons behind, so that it will help us prioritize the constraints that will be addressed in the financing strategy. So this is just a very brief introduction on the key elements within the building block 1. On the next slide, I would like to share some quick reflections from the country experiences that we have seen. The first point is on the we found out the assessment, the building block 1 assessment and diagnostics is closely linked with the development finance assessment, which is the DFA process in reality. So the DFA process will cover the assessment across all the 4 building blocks of INFF. So it is not only for building block 1, but it will also provide key information on building block 2, 3, and 4 through deep analysis. On the other hand, the building block 1 exercise on assessment and diagnostics can build on the DFA process and provide deeper further assessment and diagnostics. And the second point is that the assessment itself can leverage and consolidate different types of existing assessment and reports in order to get a more integrated picture. And this may include the existing UNDP ongoing assessments and reports, or reports from other UN systems, UN agencies, international, regional, or national organizations. And the final point of reflection is the government leadership is very important in terms of access to data and the policy documents, because this data and the policy documents will be very crucial for effective assessments. But they're not always available publicly. If we have a very strong country ownership, the access to necessary data and necessary consultations will be much easier. So that will be all from me for the very brief introduction on building block 1, assessment and diagnostics. I can now hand it over to our country office colleague from Gabon, Serge. Over to you.
Bonjour, merci. Tout le monde voit la présentation?
Oui, Serge.
Parfait. Merci, je suis donc Serge Mboula, je suis donc du PNUD Gabon. Je vais vous présenter l'expérience INFF Gabon et je vais m'appesantir uniquement sur l'évaluation du diagnostic que Ankun vient de vous présenter. Avant cela, peut-être partager clairement l'ambition du Gabon sur les 10 dernières années. Le pays s'est engagé à vouloir transformer son économie et la rendre plus diversifiée à travers le plan stratégique Gabon émergent dénommé PSG. Le Gabon, pour ceux qui ne connaissent pas, c'est un pays pétrolier, un pays à revenu intermédiaire, supérieur, avec un couvert forestier de près de 4,28%. Le Gabon est un séquestreur de carbone de plus de 100 millions de tonnes par an, un bilan carbone positif avec une biodiversité exceptionnelle. Cependant, les autorités ont planché pour traduire l'ambition de transformer l'économie sur une trajectoire durable, en inscrivant le pilier Gabon vert, qui est exceptionnel à travers les forêts, les pêches, l'agriculture, un pilier à développer afin que le Gabon soit sur une trajectoire durable. Mais on note cependant, il y a un problème au niveau des crises auxquelles il fait face quotidiennement, notamment du fait de la baisse des prix du pétrole. Et donc, il y a des problèmes dans le cadre de la relance économique, notamment post-Covid. Il y a besoin donc d'articuler avec les objectifs de long terme dans le cadre des objectifs de développement durable et de l'agenda 2063. Bien sûr, le Gabon a fait des efforts dans le cadre de sa politique durable. Il a mis en place des lois sur le développement durable depuis 2014. Il s'est engagé à réduire les gaz à effet de serre de 50%, mais aussi à gérer de manière durable les forêts. Et récemment, en 2021, il a pris une ordonnance sur les changements climatiques où il a pleinement identifié ses besoins en matière de marché carbone. La mise en œuvre de ce plan pâtit souvent de l'absence d'une stratégie de financement et on remarque qu'il y a un besoin de rationaliser cet espace de financement. C'est la raison pour laquelle, dans le cadre de ce projet, nous visons à mettre en œuvre cette stratégie en mettant en place, bien sûr, tous les nouveaux instruments de financement, notamment verts, à travers notamment la création d'un fonds vert, la fiscalité verte, mais aussi la comptabilisation du capital naturel à travers les services auxquels le Gabon rend à la planète. C'est 100 millions de carbone séquestrés par an. Et donc, voir comment on développe de nouveaux instruments de financement à travers notamment les obligations vertes et le marché carbone. Ceci se fait à travers deux axes. On veut verdir le financement, mais on veut aussi le rendre rose pour intégrer toutes les politiques inclusives liées au genre. En termes de processus, bien sûr, nous avons entamé tous les blocs, comme a présenté les précédents collègues, que ce soit sur l'évaluation diagnostique, où on s'est vraiment concentré durant l'année dernière, les dernières années, sur un ensemble d'études qui ont été nécessaires à pouvoir commencer à nourrir la stratégie de financement et aussi à nourrir le cadre de gouvernance où la primature et le Conseil national du plan d'accélération et de transformation jouent un rôle clé. En matière de financement, lors de l'analyse effectivement du DFA, on voit bien que les financements sont en baisse et les financements sont toujours sensibles au choc externe, notamment du fait des prix du pétrole qui baissent constamment et qui sont très erratiques. Et on remarque aussi que cette tendance est très baissière, du fait notamment de la composition de la structure du financement qui est abondante au niveau du secteur public. Mais elle est aussi liée du fait que la transformation économique enclenchée depuis 2010 est très lente et que ceci s'accentue davantage avec les risques au changement climatique, notamment du fait du fait de l'amusement de la production du pétrole. Alors, en matière de synergie de politique de financement, nous avons accompli un certain nombre d'activités et on se rend compte aujourd'hui que la transition vers cette économie verte va exiger un écosystème favorable, une adaptation des outils de programmation et budgétaire, comme a signifié tous les collègues avant, notamment Marcos. Mais l'idée, c'est que nous avons renforcé les capacités en matière de finances vertes avec toutes les parties prenantes, et ça en collaboration avec Citibank, qui est partie prenante dans ce processus. Nous avons renforcé les capacités sur la comptabilisation du capital naturel pour que tous ces comptes soient effectivement publiés et s'intègrent dans la planification de la programmation des comptes nationaux qui auront donc un instrument d'aide à la décision pour élargir l'espace fiscal du Gabon, pour baisser ce ratio qui est autour de 70% aujourd'hui. Nous avons lancé une étude sur la fiscalité verte. Bien sûr, si nous voulons garder cette trajectoire, il faudra mettre en place cette fiscalité où on a fait une première analyse où un certain nombre d'instruments liés à la fiscalité verte sont déjà en place, notamment les questions liées à la certification aux taxes de superficie. Il y a déjà une clarification sur les taxes de superficie non certifiées et certifiées pour le marché du bois. Nous avons aussi mené une analyse sur la finance publique verte pour pouvoir faire une meilleure taxonomie, un meilleur fléchage des dépenses publiques vertes qui surtout entrave l'environnement, mais surtout aider la direction générale du budget au niveau du ministère des Finances à construire des instruments pour orienter mieux le budget. Bien sûr, en matière de CDN, le Gabon vient d'élaborer récemment sa CDN en 2022 et il vise la neutralité carbone jusqu'en 2050 avec pour objectif maintenir ses absorptions nettes à un niveau de 100 millions de tonnes. Les besoins de cette CDN sont bien identifiés. C'est bien sûr capter tout le financement international du climat. C'est aussi capter tout le financement international du carbone. Et vous le savez certainement, le Gabon a signé avec CAFI, qui est autour de 150 millions de dollars pour la réduction des gaz à effet de serre, où effectivement sur ce pan-là, depuis juin 2021, le Gabon a reçu les premiers paiements liés au service de séquestration du carbone sur la base des services rendus. Donc 17 millions de tonnes, 17 millions de dollars, pardon, reçus en 2021. Bien sûr, le Gabon est un pays où effectivement il est encore au niveau 1 en matière de déforestation. Alors, en termes de défis, pour réussir cette transition, on voit bien qu'il y a un défi sur le financement qui est en pleine dégradation, mais aussi le Gabon fait face au problème d'érosion côtière, mais aussi au problème d'inondation. Et on voit aussi que dans des analyses dans la CDN, que la croissance au niveau forestier des arbres commence à avoir des impacts, notamment au niveau des arbres à fruits, où les fruits qui sont souvent utilisés par les éléphants commencent à manquer. Il y a une contrainte au niveau des capacités des acteurs en matière de captation de ces financements, au niveau du ministère de l'économie, ministère du budget, mais aussi au ministère des eaux et forêts, parce que tous ces nouveaux instruments sont innovants et ne sont pas encore pleinement compris, surtout au niveau du ministère de l'économie qui gère toutes les ressources de l'État. Il y a la condition d'accès au marché du carbone qui reste quand même un levier important pour amener à changer de trajectoire pour préserver les forêts. Le cadre institutionnel doit être revu pour prendre en compte toute la dimension actuelle pour aller dans ce sens. Bien sûr, les questions de reporting, les questions de modélisation du changement climatique et les questions liées aux politiques d'adaptation et de politiques d'atténuation sont au centre des défis auxquels le Gabon fait face pour pouvoir respecter ses engagements au niveau international. Voilà quelques mots sur le contexte du Gabon. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Serge. Thank you so much for that presentation and a really good example. But I believe Gabon really did the INFF on an initiative that was green from the beginning. So it's also good to know that the INFF doesn't have to be done on just national development plans. They can be done on any different strategy that the country decides to do. So thanks so much for that example. Colleagues, we have about 33 minutes left in this webinar. We will have a good 20 minutes for breakout sessions later. But I wanted to give you a chance to ask questions. You've heard we've had many presentations. We haven't given you the chance to ask questions. So we want to give you the floor for 5 minutes if you have any burning question before we move into the breakout rooms. So please, if you have a question, you can just type it in or come in. I'm not seeing any question. You can also ask those questions in the breakout session and the breakout room later. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. So Tim, I think we can launch the breakout rooms. And maybe you can walk us through how we join these rooms. Okay.
Perfect. Thanks, Kathy. So hopefully you can all see an option to attend, to join one of the breakout rooms. There are 4, 2 English, 1 French, and 1 Spanish language breakout rooms. So please, if colleagues could join, hopefully that option is available to you all now. And we may just do some juggling around to try and even out the numbers slightly so that there's a good number of people for a good discussion in each. But if you could go ahead and join now, and we'll take forward a more focused discussion in those breakout rooms. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And colleagues, you have to scroll all the way down to see the rooms. Rosemary, please come in.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Greetings from Trinidad and Tobago. Just to say, I'm not seeing the link to the breakout room. Please, if it's just me, no problem, but.
Yeah, it should appear on the screen, just like a presentation. It's a window that pops up on your screen.
Ah, it's popping up now. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
If anyone else is having trouble, please let me know, and I'll resend the message to you. I'm going to join one of the breakout rooms myself now, but if anyone else does have trouble joining one of those rooms, please send me a message on the chat and I will assign you. Geraldine, I'll do that for you now. If you'd like to be assigned to a particular language room, then please let me know that in the message.
Hello, everyone. It was difficult to leave the breakout room. I feel like we could have talked the whole day. I don't know if everybody's back. Tim, is everybody back? I see.
I think so, yeah.
The mirror board is still active.
I'm sure there are lots of colleagues still looking at the mirror board, but I think everyone is back in
That's
the...
a forced return. Like, see, nobody wanted to come back. So maybe we can talk about how to allocate more time. Yeah, we can talk about how to allocate more time for tomorrow, because I think this is the most interesting part of the webinar. Yeah, no, I think we should we can conclude now. Thank you everyone for especially the presenters and then the colleagues who introduced us to the INFF. I think it was a great learning opportunity, and this is just the beginning. I hope that you will all connect again tomorrow. The conversation will get deeper into the other building blocks. Today in our group, we were already talking about the financing strategy. I know we're not there yet, but so people are really impatient to get through all the different building blocks. So thank you for your time. Please, if you have questions, I know it's never enough time for these discussions, but I think in the time of COVID and Zoom calls, we have to limit everything to 2 hours, otherwise it gets really long. But feel free to send questions our way. If you have them between now and tomorrow, we'll try to answer them. And also reach out to colleagues in our group. Gabon was bombarded with a ton of questions. So reach out to those countries that have presented if you have specific questions for them. We are all colleagues. This is only UNDP. Please reach out and get your questions answered. So with that, I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Thank you very much, and have a good day, evening, wherever you are. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.
Colleagues, see you
Thanks
tomorrow.
all. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank
bye.
you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Wow.
Bye. Au revoir. Merci, Serge. Bye.